Hi, welcome to Workhorse Guitars. We're going to be talking guitars and guitar history and music history here in Clarksville, Tennessee. So my first guest is very hard to introduce. Phil Wood is a broadcaster in the DC area, has been for years. Radio, television, sports history. He's also a professor. He's many things. But the thing that a lot of people might not know, Phil's a musician. He has just as much knowledge about music, if you can believe it, as he does about sports. Phil also owned a music store in the DC area. He loves gear, loves guitars, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. Hope you enjoy. All right, welcome to Workhorse Guitars. I'm Rick Goodwin, and we have a guest today, friend of the channel, friend of the show, Mr. Phil Wood. I need to introduce you better than that because you're way more than a friend of the channel, friend of the show.
Not anymore.
No, that's not true. Anyway, welcome, Phil. Thank you so much for coming here, sir.
Oh, happy to be here.
Well, Phil and I, every time we get together, we talk about guitars. Of course, that's one of the many facets of Phil. Of course, sports is a thing that he has equal knowledge of, maybe even more, I don't know. He's got a pretty good knowledge of guitars, and I want to hear some of this stuff because Phil has played around here and around everywhere, and we're going to get to that for many, many years. So thanks for being here, Phil. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of your guitars and hearing some of your stories.
Well, to me, the whole thing about playing the guitar, dates back to February of 1964. I was turning 13, and that particular week was when Ed Sullivan had the Beatles on for the first time. Now, I can tell you that Sunday morning when I woke up, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would have said I want to be a Major League Baseball player. By 9 o'clock that night, I changed my mind. And I watched the Beatles, and I started to ask my mother for a guitar when I was like 8. And my mother's point was, children don't play the guitar, they play the piano. And so the first guitar I got was not really even a guitar, it was a plastic, oversized ukulele with Gene Autry's picture on it. And it was pointless. I mean, it would be, if you looked at it wrong, it would go out of tune. So I had to wait till I was 13, and then I got this cheap Czechoslovakian-made, unbranded acoustic guitar. And my mother was sure that in 6 weeks' time it would be in the closet. Well, that didn't happen. I was very motivated to play. And to make a very long story much shorter, by September, I was playing in a band. Talked my father into buying me a cheap Japanese electric guitar and an amplifier from Montgomery Ward's. And now the first band I was in, we didn't have a PA system, so we just played venture songs. And a lot of people my age now started out playing instrumentals: Walk Don't Run, Pipeline, Penetration. I mean, the hits, the instrumental hits. And I had a couple of close friends who played. And as time went by, it was evident that number one, nobody wanted to play bass, and number two, nobody wanted to sing. So I took it upon myself. I was in chorus class in high school. I said, well, I think I can sing. And so once I talked my dad into buying me a bass. And so my first electric bass was a Hagstrom, and I bought an amp at Sears. And actually those Sears amps from that period are very collectible now.
Right.
Mine was the Sears bass amp, which was 30 watts, all tube, one 15-inch speaker. And we started to practice and learn some songs and not many vocals because, again, we had to run a microphone through a guitar amplifier, which rarely worked well.
Certainly.
But we ended up playing the talent show at high school, and then my sophomore year, I got involved with some other kids, and I actually switched at that point back to guitar. And once again, Dad came through, and I got a Gibson 330. Which I still have, and we started to do Beatles and Stones and other top 40 hits because back in those days, Rick, you'd play somewhere, nobody wanted to hear your half-baked originals. They wanted to hear the hits.
Right.
They wanted songs they could dance to. I can tell you, it's writing songs is difficult at best.
For sure.
And so many young people who think they can write songs end up writing the same song over and over again.
Right. Right.
So. I played with those guys pretty much through the end of high school. Between my junior and senior year, in 1967, the number one song in the country was "Light My Fire" by the Doors. And when they played Washington, we were represented by a local booking agency, and they called up and said, "Would you like to open for the Doors?" Well, of course, there's no money in it, but you'll get a lot of mention on the radio.
Right.
Okay, so we did, and there was about a half dozen local bands who opened the show. And then I'm backstage when the Doors arrived. They had played an earlier show in Annapolis, Maryland. And it was clear that there was problems because the first three, Robbie Krieger, John Densmore, and Ray Manzarek, they showed up. No Jim Morrison. They'd left without him in Annapolis. Wow. And he finally shows up probably, I don't know, half hour later. He had gotten a ride from some kid in a yellow Corvair, and he apparently had been drinking the entire way over because at that point in time, in August of '67, I learned what the meaning of the term stinking drunk was, because you could smell him coming. And
those stories are out there about him. Eye-watering BO from Jim Morrison.
That's right.
What some books say.
Well, it's just, of course, it's August, and he's wearing leather pants, so that adds to the fragrance.
Right.
But anyway, and they're not talking to each other at all. And they finally, they go on, they're introduced by a disc jockey, and they just played their first album, start to finish. And then they left. But there's a picture of them leaving the stage, and I'm in the picture, I'm in the background of the picture, in the doorway of the green room. I should tell you, this was at the old Alexandria roller rink, which would hold about 4,000 people standing up. So the green room there was actually where they stored the skates. But they were rude and unpleasant to deal with, and which, again, I guess that's what's expected of them at that point. Now flash ahead to the summer of 2019, and Robbie Krieger is playing Ram's Head in Annapolis. And I ran into a guy at the ballpark when I'm working with the Nationals, and who actually was some kind of liaison on Capitol Hill between celebrities and congresspeople. I mentioned that having opened for the Doors, and he says, "Well, Robbie Krieger comes to town and plays the golf course at Congressional. He's coming to town. His band's going to play in Annapolis. Why don't I'll tell him about you." And sure enough, Robbie left me a ticket, and he invited me backstage, and we had a nice chat. And he still plays at SG, but he sits down and he says, "So how were we 52 years ago?" And I went, "Well, you just played the first album." He says, "No, how were we as guys?" I said, "Awful, you were terrible." And he says, "Well, I'm glad to hear that, because we went out of our way to be as nasty as possible. We thought that's what rock stars were expected to do." So anyway, he was pleasant, and his band was decent, and it was a nice evening. But I said, "Well, in 52 years, we'll come back and do this again." So.
I mean, what a fascinating band. Their story is great, and I'm glad you brought this up. I wanted you to tell this. I'm glad you told that story. Our first episode that I pre-recorded a little bit earlier is on the SG. We're doing some SG stuff, so it's very appropriate that you talk about Robbie Krieger. His book, fantastic, great read. I've read John Densmore's. I mean, I'm a Doors fan. I've always liked the Doors. They're just a very unique, original band. You either love them or you hate them.
Right, right. But once Morrison was dead, so was the band. They put out that one album that had that one song that charted on that album with Ray Manzarek singing, called "Tightrope Ride." But Robbie.
Yeah, what a songwriter.
Yeah, well, he kind of almost is self-deprecating about that. He never thought it was a brilliant piece of music until Manzarek added the intro. Yeah, and he says at that point it kind of brought the song to life. But he talked about the whole issue of playing rock and roll guitar, because he was trained as a flamenco guitarist.
Right.
And so I said, "Well, gee, you could probably be playing a lot of Mexican restaurants now." But anyway, but of course it's interesting now because Robbie Krieger is essentially a little old man. I mean, he's kind of a short guy, and he's got white hair, and his son is the singer in his band.
Oh, wow, that's great.
But anyway, still in high school, after we did that, we opened for a group called Jay and the Techniques that had some hit records back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about that is that we got there and set up our gear, and they showed up, and they came in and they said, "Listen, can we borrow your stuff? It's much better than ours."
Wow.
And it was. I mean, they were from Allentown, Pennsylvania, and their stuff was from Sears, basically. So,
Wow. Wow.
And then we opened for Dee Dee Sharp, who did Mashed Potato Time back in the '60s, had some hits.
And you were playing bass.
Well, at this point in time, I'm the guitar player.
You're the guitar, and you're playing your 330.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
And I later I got a Telecaster, and I like Fenders, but my issue with most Fenders is that I don't like that contoured body thing. I want just that square edge, which gives my arm something to rest on.
Right.
Because my arm just kept sliding off.
Oh, right. Well, that's the thing, and that's why we were talking about Workhorse guitars, because, I mean, everybody has an opinion on guitars, and, I mean, guitars are like shoes or clothes. I mean, what fits me is certainly not going to fit anybody.
Sure.
It's what I like, anybody else, and I think that's a good point about the Fender stuff with all the contours. I mean, Gibson and Fender and all the American companies copied each other.
Right.
And I'm kind of with you. Like, I just bought an American Performer Telecaster, which is basically, it looks like a 68, or it's got the humbucker right here,
Right.
and the single down there, and it doesn't have, the last Telecaster I had the belly cut on
Right.
it, and it didn't feel like a Tele to me.
Right.
It's a great guitar, but it didn't. I just wanted that classic Workhorse. There's the Tele treble thing, because that's basically, and I can't afford an Esquire, so that's why I did that.
Well, actually, I brought an Esquire with me.
See, that's great. So then we could talk about
because
that.
when I came down to Clarksville in the summer, in September of '68, a friend of mine who lived in Danville, Virginia, came to visit me, and he had just bought this Esquire, this 1953 Fender Esquire, and I had my '67 Telecaster, and he says, "Why don't we swap for 6 months?" I said, "Okay." So he took my Tele, and I took his Esquire, and then I played his Esquire around town. I liked it better than the Tele, actually. The one pickup there at the bridge was like a steel guitar pickup, and it just screamed. I mean, the treble output was incredible, and I thought, well, geez, an Esquire was good enough for Jeff Beck. I guess it's,
Exactly.
I'll make this work.
What a loss there. That guy got better and better. He's one of the few guitar players, few musicians, few rock stars that actually got better and better as he went on.
He changed.
Oh,
he
exactly.
reinvented himself because obviously when he's playing an Esquire or he's playing a Les Paul, there's no whammy bar.
Right.
Then he gets a Stratocaster and he uses it all the time.
Right.
But he uses it in a very tasteful way.
Oh, the control that he has is incredible, because he, if you watch anything, especially in the last 10, 15 years, I mean, but he's always had control over guitars. It's not a new thing,
Right.
but the volume, I mean, he'll take two little Fenders and turn them wide open, and then just work that volume. And to get all those crazy harmonics that he does, if I turned my Strat up that loud at the volume that he's turned it up, it would be very noisy and very disgusting. That's probably what a lot of people don't know or understand about him is that he is manually taking a lot of that noise out.
Sure.
And that's really hard to have that much control. I mean, I would tell Karen when we would watch a Jeff Beck video, him doing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and I'm like, I said, this guy, I said, from my vantage point, I said, he is doing like the little sand sculptures. He's just moving his hands and fingers in such...
He's writing the Lord's Prayer on a grain of rice. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well,
exactly.
it's interesting. I'm being of a certain age and living in the D.C. area, I had a chance to see so many great guitar players over the years. I mean, the week before we did the Doors show, I saw Jimi Hendrix in Washington at the Ambassador Theater. He was there for Wednesday through Sunday. And it was to get in. It was $1.50 Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday, and it was $2.50 on Friday and Saturday. I went twice. I went on Thursday and Sunday, and I'm this close to him basically because it was a movie theater where they took all the seats out, and I'm literally right there in front, and I'm watching him, and the thought that keeps running through my head, and apparently I wasn't the only one. I might as well quit. I'll never be able to do this.
Right.
And also there that same night, another guy my age who later had a great career in music, Nils Lofgren.
Oh, yeah.
And And he had pretty much the same reaction to it. I mean, Nils was basically an accordion player when he was that young.
Right.
And he was learning the guitar, and it's like, well, why am I bothering?
You know, but it wasn't just him. Even the greats were thinking that too.
Oh yeah, well,
You know?
it's the idea that, and
I mean, Nils Lofgren is fantastic
right.
as well. But I mean, you know,
but when you see Hendrix up close and you see these long, bony fingers,
right.
and the fret reach he had was like, well, this guy's from Mars. I mean, this is unnatural.
Oh yeah, I mean, the use of his thumb
Yeah.
was amazing, and you know, he had such strong hands, and again, watching Hendrix play live on film, which that's all a person I could do. You know, I'm glad we have what we have of him.
Sure.
But the live experience that you've had must have been incredible, because it was probably the sonic experience of that.
Well,
you know, there's something about a band sonically.
Well, there's another story involving that Ambassador Theater thing, which you might find interesting.
I'm all in on Hendrix
Okay.
anytime.
Well,
so that's great.
On the Sunday night, earlier that night, I had tickets. My friend Bill Cabrera and I, another player, we had tickets to see The Who open for Herman's Hermits at Constitution Hall. And so we went to that show, and I'm telling Bill about Hendrix, having seen Hendrix the previous Thursday night. So he's all hepped up, and so after The Who play their set, and Herman's Hermits came out, and they do like two songs, and he leans over and he says, "Let's go to Ambassador and catch Hendrix's last show." Okay, so we got up and we left, and he had a little Fiat. We drove down to Adams Morgan neighborhood in Washington, where the Ambassador was located.
And what year is this again?
This is August of '67.
Oh, wow.
We're finding a place to park, and we go in and pay our $1.50, and the opening band was a local band called Natty Bumppo, which was a character in James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales. And they finished their stuff, and they're pushing their gear off stage and bringing Hendrix's stuff forward. So, because there's this little break, so the people who were sitting there went to the lobby to get something to eat or smoke a cigarette, whatever. And so we parked ourselves right there where I knew Hendrix was going to be, right there. And while we're sitting there on the floor, a pose I can no longer do at my age, but anyway, my buddy is here, and he finally he looks over, and he says, "All right, now, be cool, but look slowly to your left." Well, I'm conscious that somebody has sat down next to me, because I could look down and see somebody's knee is up against mine, but I haven't looked at who's who. So I do this, and I'm looking right at Pete Townsend.
Wow.
Who is sitting right next to me, and then leaning up against the wall is John Entwistle. And there's another guy who's behind John Entwistle who I didn't know, but I recognize, his face was imprinted on my brain, basically. So before Hendrix comes out, my friend says, "Talk to him." So what am I going to say? So I turned to him, and he's looking right at me, and I said, "Great set tonight." He says, "Oh, you didn't stay for the Hermits?" And I went, "Well, no, we wanted to see Hendrix." And he said, "Have you ever seen him before?" I said, "Yeah, I saw him on Thursday." And he says, "Well, he's really like nothing else, isn't he?" And I said, yeah. So then I figured, well, we're pals now. So I said, "What was that you smashed tonight? It looked like a Fender Mustang." He said, "It was a Duosonic with a Stratocaster neck. We just keep nailing it back together. It got too expensive to smash the really good stuff."
Right.
He said, no, I said, "No more Rickenbackers." He says, "Oh, no. He says, "I've got a whole stack of busted Rickenbackers at home, but that just got too expensive." Hendrix comes out, and they haven't told him he's coming. They haven't told him that they're coming. And Hendrix comes out, and he spots Townsend, and he plugs in to his Marshall stack and starts to play "I Can't Explain."
Wow.
Well, Noel Redding, the bass player, comes out, and he's looking over. He doesn't see Townsend. He doesn't know what Jimmy's doing, and he's going, "We don't do this song." What? He's saying, "What is this, an E?" So anyway, so Hendrix is laughing, and Townsend's laughing, and Entwistle's laughing, and so Hendrix stops, and Redding figures out what's going on, and they start their set. And well, Hendrix finishes his show that night with the end of the Monterey thing, Wild Thing,
Right.
Sets the Strat on fire, and starts whacking. And everybody's standing up at that point, and chunks of wood are flying, and strings are breaking.
Yeah, and he's smashing real Stratocaster.
Yes.
Yep.
And a string pops off, and hits me right in the chest and falls down. And so I reached down and I picked it up and I coiled it up and put it in my pocket. And it still had some char from the flames on the end of it.
Oh, that's great.
And so I still have it. Well, I say this, I gifted that to my daughter Becky, who's big into 60s rock and roll.
Oh, well, that's...
Now, I mentioned the guy who was standing behind John Entwistle. So this is August of 67. Flash ahead to 1973, and I'm working at WTOP in Washington, combined TV and radio station. And I'm in the lunchroom in the basement, and I'm sitting at a table with my back to the door. And a guy walks in, and they used to have these soda machines where you'd put the money in, and a cup would drop down and drop ice in it. And
right.
So he's at that machine, he puts his money in, gets his soda, and he turns around and starts to walk out. And I said, "Excuse me, but weren't you at the Ambassador Theater with Hendrix, Townsend, and John Entwistle in '67? And he goes, "Yeah, how'd you know that?" I said, "I just remember your face." And he said, "How could you remember my face from a brief sight?" And I said, "It was the circumstance."
Right.
That whole thing was kind of burnt into my
Sure.
mind. So anyway, it turns out he was the guy that was hired to schlep the Who around town, and he ended up with a pair of Keith Moon's drumsticks. And he gave me one of them.
Wow.
Which
wow.
I also gave to my daughter Becky.
All
so.
right, Becky, that's fantastic.
Well, it was such a significant moment. I mean, 67, the summer of love, whatever you want to call it.
I mean,
musically was amazing.
That's my favorite period. You know, out of all the 60s, of course, I love the Beatles and so many others. But really for me, because I'm a guitar player, 67 was the year that it began the golden age of guitar players for me, for my taste. You know, there was great players, of course, before, but those are my favorites.
Well,
And,
you look at those guys, and the Yardbirds thing with Clapton, Beck, and Page. And,
right.
And I over in my life, I've seen Clapton play twice. I saw Jimmy Page play with the Yardbirds in '66.
Was he playing bass or guitar?
He was playing guitar. Beck had just left the group, and he was playing a Telecaster with a rosewood fingerboard. And then I saw Beck in the summer of '69 at the Laurel Pop Festival with the Jeff Beck Group, which featured Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
great.
yeah.
Well, that's my favorite. I've got many. Everyone has many Jeff Beck favorites,
Right.
but I mean, with the vocals, that's the first two albums, right? That lineup, right? You know,
Right.
fantastic. And you and I had talked about. I love those '60s bands. For one, the main thing is because it was minimally produced, or it was brilliantly produced in the fact that they didn't have the luxury of auto-tune. I mean, bands actually had to be good, and I think the reason why that music still resonates with people, like I love Vanilla Fudge, because the live aspect.
I saw them live. They played the.
Tell us about Vanilla. I love Vanilla Fudge.
You Keep Me Hanging On was a big hit in the charts, and the Elks Lodge in Fairfax, Virginia, used to bring in national acts. So they brought in Vanilla Fudge, and they were brilliant.
Oh, for sure.
And then they brought in other bands like the Ohio Express and the Left Bank, actually the Left Bank played my senior prom in high school.
Is that right?
Yeah, but I mean the Fudge were so different. And Tim Bogert playing bass was not, he was doing things other bassists were not doing.
Well, he's like Jeff Beck in the sense that it's like, you can't really copy him.
No.
You can play but he's so unique and so, the dexterity, and he's also technically really good too. And he's just a very unique style.
Right.
And obviously him and Jeff Beck and Carmine went on
Well,
to play
sure.
together, of course.
The other thing I have to mention here, when I first got my cheap Czechoslovakian acoustic guitar for my birthday in '64, I tried to take, my mother signed me up for lessons with the county, basically. And they were group lessons and an hour long, but there's like 25 kids in class and no one knew how to tune it. So the first 45 minutes of class was taken up with the instructor walking around tuning everybody's guitar. So after six weeks, I gave up. I bought a chord book and a copy of Chuck Berry's Greatest Hits. And it took me a while to figure out that Chuck's songs were mostly written in piano keys.
Right.
And it was a matter of, well, wait a minute,
Right.
why isn't this a major key, you know? Chuck's doing songs in F and B flat, yeah.
Right.
So at that point in time, a neighbor of mine who had been playing a lot longer than I had explained to me, this is what he's doing. His piano player is probably writing a lot of this stuff,
Right.
which it turns out that was happening. Johnny Johnson, his piano player.
Right.
So,
And also they had sped up the recordings in post to make him sound younger because he was older.
Right.
And I'm not saying that happened on every single
Sure.
song because it's piano, but some of those tunes are in an odd, they're not in 440, right?
Right,
So,
right.
and it was because, and they still do this.
Right.
It's a common trick is to make someone sound a little
well,
younger, speed it up.
I'm a big
tempos.
fan of Carl Perkins, and he did a song called "Your True Love," which was a hit more in Europe than here. But clearly, Sam Phillips sped up the tape because it sounds like a 13-year-old boy singing it.
Right. And it's still common practice. I mean, they do that. They don't actually speed up a tape, but they do speed up things. I mean, and you know, it was a common practice back then for television and film, just to get things to sync up too. You know, and because some of the films or rock documentaries I watched from the 70s, like especially like The Who, I love The Kids Are All Right, but some of the songs in there are like, whoa, this is way too fast, different key, it's higher pitch. It's clearly been sped up so they could, you know, they didn't have digital sync back then, you know, and if things were off.
Well, and The Who, again, in the early days were essentially a cover band. They did
Right.
a lot of Motown stuff and with just that, you know,
R&B.
sparse instrumentation. I mean, they were like, there's video of them doing, it's like they're playing a dance in some place in England doing the song, I Have to Dance to Keep from Crying, which is an old Motown hit, and it's great, it's terrific. But then you look at the songwriting evolution of Pete Townsend,
Right.
and it's like something touched him along the way.
Oh, for sure. You know, I mean, and the guy is very prolific. I mean, read his book as well. I mean, I love rock and roll. I love the stories. Their stories are just fascinating because they're in unique situations and you know, if you put a lot of people in these situations, you're going to have an interesting story because it's a weird life to travel like that and to have, you know, to either have crazy adoration or bomb.
Right. Oh, yeah.
You know, and even for them, even the largest rock stars are going, how long is this going to last? Am I going to have to go back to work at the hardware store? Am I going to have to go back to school? Am I going to blow my...
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, the guy who was the principal guitar player for Gene Vincent, Cliff Gallup, terrific player, well, he quit rock and roll to be a barber. And it's like, well, I guess to each his own. But his style of playing rockabilly was largely copied by Jeff Beck when Jeff Beck made his rockabilly album,
Right.
using a Gretsch like Cliff Gallup played. But it's one of those things where rock and roll is a tough lifestyle.
For sure.
And as we've seen over the years, so many of the good die young. And it's just, when I played in bands and we played in bars, and this is before most bars had smoke eaters.
Right.
And it was tough. I
Oh,
mean,
sure.
fighting that smoke every night. You get home, everything you're wearing smells like smoke.
Oh, for sure.
And so many guys I played with, because people would frequently buy you a beer to play a certain song. Well, I never drank. They all did. And so one night playing with a band that had we had a sax player, and by the middle of the second set, he couldn't play. It was just, he couldn't stand up barely. But so there's a lot of substance abuse that's been around for years.
Oh, for sure. You know, and even you know, it's not a healthy lifestyle to tour anyway, even if you don't abuse drugs. Just because of the close quarters and you're shaking hands and meeting people, you're coming in contact with so much germs, for one. But two, the lack of sleep, you know, and constantly in a van or a bus or a car or, you know, and doing that for 30, 40 days straight.
We haven't really gotten into my broadcasting career, but in teaching at Austin Peay and teaching sports broadcasting skills, the number of young men who come to college who have it in their mind they want to be a TV or radio sportscaster, but many of them don't really know a lot.
Right.
It's like they've got football covered, but beyond that. And so when you tell them that, well, in the real world, you can't pick and choose the sports that you cover. Someone will do that for you. They're slack-jawed. They are, really? And we have to write our own scripts? What? So there's a perception that it's easy.
Oh, right. Well, because like a musician, or like on camera talent, television hosts and things like that. I mean, that's part of your job to make it look easy. When I played, I'm nervous. Oh my God! Everybody's like, "Oh God, you're such a ham. You get up there and clown around." I mean, even tell my bandmates, I'm like, "Oh no, God, I can't take it. I'm really nervous." He's like, "Well, you don't look nervous." I'm like, "Well, that's a showbiz trick. You're supposed to not look nervous. You're supposed to walk on there with confidence, just like when you don't want to be on camera. If you're not feeling well that day, or haven't had sleep, or have been delivered bad news, whatever the case, the show must go on, and your job is to nail it with the same enthusiasm, whether you feel good or not."
Well, as I tell the students, if you actually get a job and they assign you to do something, never say no. Do everything they ask you to do, even if you've never done it before. There's a guy who is still alive. He's quite elderly now, but named Jim West. He was a broadcaster in Baltimore for years, and he had done football, he had done baseball, but in 1962, Baltimore got a minor league hockey team, and WBAL radio, where Jim worked, said, "You're going to be the play-by-play voice of this team." He had never seen a hockey game before in his life. So he got a rule book, he read the rule book and said, "Well, this is a lot like lacrosse. I've done lacrosse." So the first game he broadcast was the first game he'd ever seen. Well, 5 years later, he's the voice of the Chicago Blackhawks in the National Hockey League. So it's just, you never know what you're capable of until you try it.
Right. It's true. And the same if you're a young musician, or if you're whatever you want to do. It's like, I used to work at Gibson Guitars 20 plus years ago, and I just wanted a job. I just wanted to be near guitars. Sure. And I was willing to do whatever to get in the door. I just want to get in the door. I'll mop, I'll clean toilets, whatever it is. And they're like, okay. And it's still, at that time, it was a long line to get in. You had to go for interviews and take testing and all this stuff, in order to make $7 an hour and packing Les Pauls in boxes, right? So, but I was willing to do it. And I'm like, I just want to be around that.
Sure.
And that was the great thing about going to work there, because when you got in, everybody else was like that too. Everybody else played in band. Everybody else. That was the most humbling experience I've ever had in my entire life, was I thought, well, I'm pretty good. And I was 26, probably thought, I thought quite a bit of my playing and my talent. And I found out after about 30 minutes that, oh my God, it was humiliating how good musicians are, especially in Nashville in that situation. I'd never seen anything like it in my life.
When I owned a music store in Maryland for about 5 years, I quickly realized there will never be a shortage of great guitar players in the United States.
That's right.
People would come in and they'd take something off the wall and they'd sit and they'd play, and they'd be brilliant. And you'd say, "Where do you play?" And he says, "In my basement." "You ever played in a band?" Never have, no. I just play for my own enjoyment. Well, you could, but it's pointless to try to talk them into it. They've already decided I want to play, but I don't want to play in front of people.
Right.
And so, but it happened almost daily.
Oh, for sure.
And so when I came down to Clarksville in the fall of '68 to go to college, and the very, I guess, first or second week I was here, I had my Telecaster with me, and I'm sitting in my room at Miller Hall, and the window's open, because that didn't have AC at the time. And I'm just picking something simple, and there's a knock on the door, and there's a young man from Clarksville who was actually living in the dorm that quarter, named Bobby Daniel, who you probably know. And he said, "Hey, I heard you play. You want to come out with me tonight to sit in with my band?" So he tells me he's got this band called The Web, and they're playing the Little Officers Club at Fort Campbell. So I said, "Well, I don't have a car." He said, "Well, I'll drive you. Don't worry about it." And it was a momentous evening. I went out there and I met Chuck Emery, Tommy Armstead, and Marshall Pearson. and Bunky Boyd, who's been around town for a long time. And I went up and played some songs with them. And because the standards, top 40 stuff, everybody plays in the same key anyway. So it wasn't a matter of not knowing the material.
Sure.
So on the basis of that, I ended up with other people asking me to come and sit in with their bands. And of course, in the end, not quite a year later, the summer between 69 and 70, Chuck Emery left to play in Florida with a band, and they asked me to take his place. And so that was a band called the Rubber Duck by that time. And so I played with them for quite some time. And it was extremely enjoyable. But here's the thing. When I was in the DC area, I thought I was pretty much run-of-the-mill as far as my skill set went. But I came down here, and somehow people perceived me as being better. And so I'll take it, you know. And honestly, Rick, I think the fact of the bands I had seen play live gave me some cred I might not have had otherwise.
Well,
I had seen Hendrix, I'd seen the Beatles, I'd seen the Stones, I'd seen, you know, so many major bands that never came through Clarksville.
Right. Well, but that is credit, because you get to see their showbiz tricks. You know, like even a great band like Van Halen, right? So I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and you know, Eddie Van Halen was like the Jimi Hendrix for my generation, right? You know, because everybody's like, what is that guitar sound? And it was similar. That's the closest thing as I'll get to experiencing Hendrix that way. Because everybody's like, wow, how is he getting that sound? What's he doing with the tremolo arm? Blah, blah, blah. Well, when they got signed to Warner Brothers, I think it was Don Landy or Ted Templeman, they took them and they said, look, you guys are great. Congratulations, welcome to Warner Brothers, basically. But we're going to go see The Who tonight, and we're going to show you something. And they loved The Who. They were like, sure, let's go see The Who. They listened to all their records. Like, have you ever seen them? They're like, oh, no. They said, well, here you go. So they took them to see The Who, and then they're like, okay, we get it. We know what we need to do now. They've raised the bar, and, you know, it's like, okay, here's what they do. And so by you seeing these bands, now you know where the bar is. I mean, you know, where other people that may not have a chance to see these A-list performers, you know, you're exposed to, okay, here's where the bar is, and you adjust your playing and style, and you know, this is what consists of the top show.
Well, there were two other guitar players in the DC area who were largely unknown until, I guess, the 70s. One was a gentleman named Roy Buchanan, and the other was a guy named Danny Gatton. And
two Telecaster guys, right?
And Roy was in a local band called the British Walkers, who had a regional hit with a song called I Found You, which actually Roy had written. But then Roy quit the band and joined another band called the Jumping Jacks, and I saw them live. They opened for the Stones in '65. But the thing about Roy is that nobody else could play Roy's guitar because the action was so high and the strings were so heavy. And it was like, this guy he's able to bend steel with his bare hands. I mean, to be able to play that. And Gatton, what he could do with a beer bottle and a Telecaster was amazing. So, and of course, they both ended up taking their own lives, which was really a total waste. And but they had some personal issues, some demons. But again, so great, so skilled, and so uniquely skilled that no one can do what they did.
Right, yeah, uncopyable.
Yeah.
My boss, Roger Fritz, great guitar player at Gibson. He has a company called Fritz Brothers Guitars, and they're handmade. And I mean, he built them for George Harrison, and Roy Buchanan was one of his signature artists. And I was misinformed. I thought, well, there are people who build guitars, and then there are people who play guitars.
Well, when I found out when I had the store, there are people who own guitars,
right,
and buy guitars, but don't actually play them.
Right.
They see them as pieces of art.
Right. So in my experience at Gibson with Roger, And we saw some of those art. Yeah, I ran into that too. We had some doctors and dentists who didn't play, but they would buy $20,000, $30,000 guitars at the time. And so Roger, not only was he a brilliant luthier, you give him a pocket knife and a telephone pole, and he would come back with something beautiful.
Right.
He made his first guitar with out of a stylus.
Sure.
And
Works.
wired it up. And carved it out. He's very good at woodworking, but amazing guitar player. And it seems like the better the luthier, in my experience, and I'm not a very good luthier, the better the player. All the top players that I knew and that I liked at Gibson were just brilliant guitar players. I mean, because that's one of the things they had figured out. These guys had figured out every nuance on a guitar, and they were wanting to shave off just a tenth, get a paper thin's edge, and they're like, how can we make this better? And they could just paint them beautifully and have all these great ideas.
And well, from 50 plus years ago when I started to play to now, it's much easier to learn to play now. And there's so many shortcuts people have found. And so every time I run into somebody who said, well, I always wanted to play when I was a kid, but I'm too old. I said, no. I said, there's so many free lessons that are out there, and it's so much easier to learn to play now than it was. When I started, if you wanted to take lessons, they wanted to teach you Red River Valley. Right. They wanted to teach you Clementine, Home on the Range. So I said, if you'd say, well, can you show me Roll Over Beethoven? It was like, what's that? That's why you need Chuck Berry.
Right. Well, brilliant songwriter. How prolific was that guy? And of course, one of the most influential guitar players ever.
Yeah, growing up in the D.C. area, which is, of course, the city itself in the 50s and 60s was about 70% black, and so there's a lot of R&B radio to listen to. And in the Friday newspaper, they would list the charts for the radio stations in town, and the R&B stations would list these songs I'd never heard of. So I would tune them in and hear these songs, and they would play a lot of Bo Diddley stuff. And now, Bo Diddley was an unusual name, and of course, when you're 10 or 11 years old, you think is that his real name? Is it possible that a last name like Diddley? Well, anyway, I listened to the records, and then when I turned 13 and I got the guitar, and then I started to buy more records at that point. And I bought a copy of Bo Diddley's Greatest Hits. And I loved it, but I also noticed that Bo frequently is not entirely in tune. There was a guy who used to do work for my dad named Bobby Smith, and he was telling me that he played the guitar, and he had bought the Bo Diddley home guitar course. So I said, well, so I handed him mine, and he said, well, this isn't in tune. I said, yes, it is. And he says, no, it's not. Well, then the more I looked into Bo Diddley and realized Bo tuned to an open E chord. So he just needed one finger to play. And obviously, I think there were times when, and he recorded for Checker, which was a subsidiary of Chess in Chicago, where they said, all right, Bo, we've got 13 minutes to record this album side. Go, So anyway. But when I saw more pictures of Bo Diddley, and I saw that he played this rectangular-shaped guitar, and I said, I've never seen those at a store. Wow, that's really interesting. That's cool. And so it wasn't until, I guess, the 1990s that Gretsch actually started to sell a Bo Diddley model. And so I have to have one of those. I just have to have one. So I got one, and then while I was playing bass in the band I was playing in, then the guitar player in the band wanted to play this, so he played it out a lot.
Oh, that's great.
So it did get some use, but it's the gold plating and the red color, and it's solid body, though it's got some hollow spots in it. But
right, so there's some chambering.
Yeah.
There's some chambering going on these.
Yeah.
I know, which is great because that gives it a little bit of an airy tone.
I played in a band in the 60s with a guy who had a Gretsch Jet Firebird with these pickups. He said that he called them Forple because they was 4 lines of heads. But it's got a very comfortable neck. But again, I don't play with one finger, so. But obviously, I've done it. I've tuned it up to an open E.
Little things like that in regards to tuning and stuff. Now you can find out more about Bo Diddley's or anyone's guitar more than they probably even knew.
Sure.
Because of the internet and because there's a great guitar websites out there.
Well, not only that, if you got the Roland synth equipped Strat, you didn't even have to retune it. You could just dial it in, and it would be you'd play standard tuning, but it would come out like it was open tuning.
Exactly. You know, they have guitars on the market that will play or pedals you can get that will do that stuff. But you know, that's the thing. You know, back then, you know, everything was more mysterious. You didn't know because some of that players kept to themselves for good reason.
Well, what's interesting about Bo, whose real name was Ellis McDaniel, is that he was actually he took violin lessons for 12 years as a kid. So he knew what tuning was all about.
Certainly.
And and he ended up using the guitar almost as a percussion instrument.
Right.
With that kind of shave and a haircut 2 bits rhythm that was copied by a lot of other artists on hit records. D. Clark, Hey Little Girl is clearly a Bo Diddley song.
Oh, well, the Doors were heavily influenced by Bo. I mean, as well as probably all the bands we had talked about previously. The Doors, The Who.
I got to see Bo in person a number of times. And actually, on occasion, he would be on the same bill with Chuck Berry, which was always fun. But I never got to meet him. I always regretted that. But there's a guy I know in Northern Virginia who was in Detroit for some reason, and he was out driving early one morning, and he sees a guy walking up the sidewalk, and he says to himself, "That's Bo Diddley." And so he stops, he rolls down the window and said, "Hey, Bo, do you need a ride?" And it was Bo Diddley, and he came over and he says, "Well, I'm just looking for a place to go have breakfast." And he says, "Well, get in." And so he goes out to breakfast with Bo Diddley.
Wow.
And so it's that if Bo Diddley is that kind of guy that'll get in a car with a perfect stranger to go have breakfast, he's my kind of guy. You know?
Right. You know, how many guitar players can you ask, or you know, you can ask any drummer, "Hey, I need a Bo Diddley beat here. This is a Bo Diddley beat." You know, I mean, not many guitar players have a rhythm named after them that everyone immediately knows what you're talking about.
Right.
You know, and that's quite an achievement because you don't have to be Jeff Beck to be original. It's hard enough being original to have your guitar voice identified.
Now, if you tell me that Andre Segovia would occasionally tune to an open E, and I would fall off my chair. But you know, Bo was unique in that sense. And yet, if you remember the singer back in the 50s, Jimmy Rogers, who sang Honeycomb and a few other, well, he would frequently accompany himself on guitar. He had a archtop Gibson, non-electric, but it was tuned to an open E, and he played with his thumb. And I thought, okay, well, he took the Bo Diddley course too.
Right. You know, and I think when I think over the thumb, I think of Richie Havens. And, you know, he did a lot of open tunings
But boy, Richie could just rip through the top of that Guild acoustic he played. I mean, I guess that's where Willie Nelson was inspired.
Right. You know, I couldn't imagine playing so much. I mean, well, that's a technique. You know, that's a technique that, you know, he
was a softer pick, Richie.
The over the thumb, I mean, you know, like you said, when you were talking about Hendrix, that was one of the things. His hands were massive, and he's one of those that you could watch all day.
When I saw Hendrix, and he would bar a chord like this.
Right.
And so my thumb was big enough that I could do that. It didn't make me a better player, but I could do that.
Well, that's a very, very cool guitar.
Bo Diddley used a later model with a more oddball shape, which he ended up giving to Billy Gibbons, and then they started to reproduce them, called it the Billy Bo, and then they made a reverse version of it, which I don't know that they sold as well as these, but I mean, you rarely see even any of these in stores.
That's right. You know, the Billy Bo had a couple of cutaways, but it was kind of I mean, it was chambered, but I mean, that's the classic. That's the classic Bo Diddley there. That's the one in all the posters on the covers. He had this custom made
originally.
Yes, that was his special order guitar, not in production.
Right. It's on the cover of some of his albums, and actually before he had this, he played another Gretsch, like a Jet Firebird, the single cut, and then before that he used to play Kay electric guitars.
Right.
So of course when we were growing up, Kay was seen as kind of an off-brand.
Right.
But now they've become very collectible.
Right. The person that I had mentioned, Roger Fritz, he went on to work for Kay later on, and so he has reissued a lot of those.
Kay had the original Barney Kessel model.
Right. Yeah, with the gold foil pickups and the hollow body. Oh yeah, I certainly. Oh man, that is a nice. Ooh, ebony. That's great. That's an ebony board. You know, that's getting rare.
Oh, but it's because of these, what used to be
Man, that
considered
feels great.
like exotic woods are you can't import them anymore.
Right. That neck feels great, Phil. That is nice. Oh, that's great. So it's got the cavity for it. That's a smart design, you know, because a lot of times they don't do that, you know. It's like you just hope your 335 or anything doesn't ever go out for it. You're going to have to fish that stuff out. So, no, that's gorgeous, gorgeous. Gretsch is, Gretsch are fine guitars. And this is, you got a matching ebony bridge there for the tailpiece, for the bridge that's sitting on there. That's great. That's fantastic.
In one of the mid-'60s appearances of the Rolling Stones on Ed Sullivan's show, Keith Richards was playing this, what I thought initially was a Les Paul, and the more I looked and I saw the Chesterfield on the headstock, I realized it was a Guild. And I've never seen that particular Guild. Well, Guild had made this instrument called an Aristocrat back in the 50s. And I ended up finding one at Hughley's in Nashville, a used one, very, very cheap. And I bought it, and I thought, this is the lightest guitar I've ever played. And I played it for a number of years, and then I ended up trading it for something else, as many of us end up doing as stupid young people. Guild kind of went out of business, and they came back in business, and they reissued the Guild Aristocrat. And because as I have aged, I have been less able to shoulder a Les Paul heavy guitar. Even a Stratocaster is a little on the heavy side.
Sure.
So this thing is so light. You could play this all night long with no strain at all.
I couldn't believe how light
it was. It's a
was.
true hollow body.
Wow.
Hollow all over. There's no wooden block in the middle.
And there's no, and that's the great thing, because it's not a feedback monster.
Right.
You know,
There's
because
no
there's
hole.
no F holes.
Right.
Man, that's one of the lightest ones I've picked up.
Yeah. Well,
That's
if you're going to
really
play a
cool.
bar gig and have to do 4 sets or 5 sets, the last thing you want to shoulder is a Les Paul, quite frankly.
Oh, for sure, because I've got some very heavy ones
Yeah.
before they started chambering them.
Yeah.
And there's a few on that rack over there
Right.
that weigh way too much.
Yeah.
It hurts.
Oh, sure it does.
know,
And so I reached the point where I refused to play anything that heavy again.
Right.
But then somebody said, you need to try this strap. And so I found this strap, and it's got these bubbles on it, on the inside of it. So when it goes against your shoulder, and it spreads out the weight so evenly that it's remarkable
that's great.
how comfortable it is. Now I think it was like $50, but it was worth every cent.
Oh, for sure.
And adjustable for length and everything, and it's a brilliant design, and some guy I hope made $50 off designing that strap, because the straps we grew up playing were just basically thin pieces of vinyl
right.
with cloth on one side, or maybe a leather strap.
Right.
But so it's that's a great strap.
And even the ones that had the fake wool
Yeah.
sheep, but they would usually have a little short strip that would actually defeat the purpose of.
Correct. It was for aesthetics, basically.
Right,
Yes. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right. That's fantastic, man. What a light! I don't know that I've held a lot of guitars.
Well, the point
and that's
is,
one of the lightest ones I've ever held.
But I never saw him play it again. I don't know. Did he get rid of it? Did somebody steal it? I don't know. Yeah, the one I had earlier was a different kind of a sunburst finish than this one. But when they reissued this, I said, well, I got to get one of those again. It's one of those things where the things you owned 50 years ago that you regretted getting rid of, you have a chance to replace a lot of them now.
Right. Tell me about the one that got away. And I know there are probably several, because I have several, but there is one, right? The one that got away. What was the one?
Well, it's a Clarksville story. When I was down here as a student, and I don't remember who told me this story initially, but he says, there's an old guy outside of town that has a Les Paul he's been trying to sell for years. I said, have you seen it? He says, yeah. He says, it's sunburst, and I think it's from the late 50s, and so I got the guy's name. I won't give his name because it's a unique name, and I'm sure. Well, I think he may be deceased now, but
Sure.
Anyway, so I asked around at other people who had heard the story but never saw it, and never called this guy. Never made an attempt to call this guy. So this is like 1969. This story is.
Right.
when my friend from Danville, Virginia came to visit me, I told him that story, and he remembered it as well. So in 1973, some years later, he's back in Danville, and he's talking to a friend of his, and he says, I heard this story when I was in Clarksville some years ago. This guy's got this old Les Paul, da da da. Well, his friend says, did you call the guy? And he said, no. He says, well, with a name like that, he's probably the only one in the book. So he got the guy's number, and he called him up, and the guy was a farmer, and he said, yeah, I still got that thing. I thought I had it sold a couple of years ago, but the guy backed out, and I think it's under the bed, and So he says, well, if I drive down there, I'm really interested. And he says, well, come on down. So it was like a 10-hour drive. And he goes to the guy's house, and he pulls out this case, and it's the classic Lifton case. And it's a 1960, the last year of the original single-cut Les Paul.
Right.
Highly flamed sunburst finish.
Oh, man.
Beautiful condition. And the original sales slip. And he said, what do you want for it? He says, I want what I paid for it. So it was roughly $350.
Oh, my goodness. And even in 73, that's a deal.
Yeah. Oh, incredible deal. So my friend buys it, takes it back to Danville, and plays it. He plays in a band that tours for a while, and he plays that guitar. And all the while, he's checking out the price of these vintage Les Pauls, and it keeps going up and up and up. So finally, he decided he was going to stop playing that one. So he would play a Les Paul reissue, or he would play something else on the road. But he kept that guitar in great shape. And in 2011, he called me up and he said, I think I'm going to sell the 1960 Les Paul. He said, I figure based on what things are going for now that I can probably pay off every bill I have and maybe fund my retirement to some extent. He ends up selling it through George in Nashville.
Right.
And
George Gruen.
George Gruen, yes. Who I dealt with when he had the shop around the corner at GTR on 4th Avenue. And I bought a 57 Les Paul Special from him.
Wow.
But anyway, he sold it for $185,000.
Wow.
And he did indeed paid off bills. And
what year was
this? Was 2011.
2011.
And and I said, well, you can bet George got a lot more than that for it when he sold it. But the point is, $350, $185,000.
I mean, that's a lottery ticket,
so
basically.
In essence, that's the one that got away because
Right.
I had an opportunity to get it. Everybody else in town did too.
Right.
And
man.
so it's one of those things where when my friend sold it, he said, I feel like I should give you some of this money. I said, no, don't worry about it. I said, you had the initiative to do it.
Right.
The rest of us dropped the ball.
You're exactly right on that. It's like, well, I'm thinking about calling. I thought I should do that, and the guy could have went there, drove all the way there, and it could have been nothing.
Sure.
Or it could have been,
a
in
Gene
two
Autry
pieces
guitar.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I had one of those. Too.
Yeah,
they still made those even when I was a kid, And then later on in the late 70s, they changed Gene Autry's picture to Kiss. So I had one with Kiss on it. So,
yes.
The
makeup never worked on Gene. So,